Flash floods have hit parts of Saudi Arabia as heavy rainfall has been recorded across the kingdom since last week.
Recently, Saudi Arabia has been hit by floods due to heavy rains almost every year. At the end of 2022, the kingdom suffered the largest flooding in recorded history, turning the desert into a swamp. Why is this happening now? In an arid climate where up to 100 millimeters of rainfall has been a usual annual participation rate for thousands of years. It's astonishing how quickly the desert turns into a fertile farmland. How did they manage to change the climate? Is there something we don't know? What is going on in the Arabian Peninsula, actually? The mystery of Saudi Arabia. What do we know about this country? How arid was it originally? Saudi Arabia is the largest country in the Arabian Peninsula. However, over 90% of its territory is desert land, and one of the largest deserts in the world, Rub al-Khali, with an area of about 650,000 square kilometers, stretches in the southeast of the country. The temperature record registered in Rub al-Khali is plus 56 degrees centigrade in the shade. The annual rainfall is about 35 millimeters. For comparison, in Rome, not the rainiest European city, the annual rainfall is 663 millimeters. Well, to form a complete picture, imagine there are no permanent rivers in the country at all. There are only 6 countries in the world, and Saudi Arabia is one of them. How to survive in such conditions, let alone develop an agricultural sector? By and large, there is no way. It is impossible to survive in the desert, but it's quite possible to do it near the shores of the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, and not only to survive, but also to practice agriculture. There have been settlements on the coasts of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea for several thousand years, and they've lived not only by fishing, but also by livestock breeding and crop farming. Where did they get the water from? It is simple. They dug wells. Near the sea, groundwater is usually close to the surface, so they didn't have to dig very deep. In addition, they built dams to retain rainwater. It is difficult to imagine it now, but the Arabian Peninsula looked very different 10,000 years ago. The climate was more humid, and many regions of Arabia were covered in forests and vegetation. Some lands were natural oases where people could live and farm. The climate has changed over time. Water bodies dried up and rivers turned into beds, wadis, which fill up with water only after a few rains. Geography seems to have played a cruel joke on the once flourishing peninsula. The fact is that for the last few thousand of years, mainly western winds have been blowing over Arabia. The Atlantic saturated air passes through the sweltering north of Africa, losing precious moisture. But that's not all. The air that has passed the heat of Africa hits the mountain range and, if it has any moisture left, it rains on the west coast, leaving the central and eastern regions of the country arid. As much as 90% of the rainwater goes into the Red Sea. To give you an idea of the amounts we're talking about, let's take the Al-Baidha region of the west coast. For example, according to experts, the amount of rainwater that goes into the sea at one time is sufficient of watering 140 million trees for 3 years. We'll come back to this fact later. When a country has over 90% desert land, the last thing one would think of is developing agriculture. However, in the 1930s, huge oil resources were discovered here. The resources proved to be so abundant that it shocked everyone. At that time, it was about 20% of the world's resources. The discovery of these deposits was one of the greatest breakthroughs in the oil industry in the world history. By the 70s, this had converted into export and good national revenue. It was time to think about many things, like how to make good use of such wealth. To think about food security as well. As a result, at the turn of the 70s and 80s, a government program for the development of advanced agricultural technologies, building quality roads to the agricultural regions, creating modern irrigation networks, etc., was adopted. This resulted in the shocking success of Saudi Arabia. In the first stage of the program, special attention was paid to the development of the dairy, meat and poultry industries. The result was not long in coming. Already by the mid-80s, the local farms fully covered the domestic demand for most meat and dairy products. The achievement in wheat production were even more impressive. The first granaries were built in the country just in 1978, and by 1984, Saudi farmers were fully satisfying domestic demand for wheat. In 1989, Saudi Arabia harvested 3.1 million tons of grain, 15 times more than in 1980. In less than 10 years, the country went from importer to exporter of grains, supplying products to more than 30 countries, including China and the USSR. Just a giant leap in 10 years. But how did this country go from food importer to exporter in such a short period of time, whilst almost all of its land was desert? What do they do that we don't know about? And here are equally eye-opening numbers. In 1961, the country had only 11.4 square kilometers of arable land, which was 0.5% of the country. In 2016, that number reached 35,000 square kilometers, slightly less than the territory of the Netherlands and slightly more than the territory of Belgium. Everyone knows Saudi Arabia is rich in oil deposits. That's right, the country is one of the world leaders in oil production and has 1/5 of all explored oil resources on Earth. Not everyone knows that Saudi Arabia also has huge reserves of groundwater. Interestingly, there exists two types of deposits. Shallow groundwater, which relies on precipitation and is a renewable source, and deep groundwater, called fossil or sedimentary, which is non-renewable. There are 6 main sedimentary aquifers in Saudi Arabia, located in the eastern and central parts of the country. Sedimentary aquifers lie at depths of 300 meters to 1.5 kilometers, so a couple of hundred years ago it was simply impossible to use them. Starting in the 1970s, Saudi Arabia started an extensive renovation of its irrigation system. Numerous wells were drilled to extract water from sedimentary rocks. The most well-known and significant underground water resource in Saudi Arabia is the Arabian Aquifer system, which covers about 1.35 million square kilometers in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. It's the largest water deposit in Western Asia, which contains water that has accumulated over thousands of years. The problem is that the use of non-renewable sources has quickly become prevalent over renewable sources at a ratio of about 5:1, which has rapidly depleted the former. Let's consider the Sakram Aquifer, which holds 103,360 billion cubic meters of water. In 2 decades of its active exploration, the water level in this deposit has already dropped by 60 meters. Moreover, over 80% of the water used was for agricultural purposes. So is the case with other aquifers. Scientists calculate that given the current rate of water consumption, Saudi Arabia will have no non-renewable water reserves left in 50 years. However, the Saudi rulers don't plan to leave future generations without water resources. So different water production methods are being researched, developed, and implemented. Currently, Saudi Arabia is the world's largest producer of desalinated water, with about 5 million cubic meters produced per day. The country accounts for 18% of the world's desalinated water production. Today, about 50% of drinking water comes from desalination, 40% from the mining of non-renewable groundwater, and only 10% from surface water in the mountainous southwest of the country. The purification industry is developing rapidly, resulting in an increased volume of recycled water. That is, purified water that has already been used. Mostly, we are talking about wastewater. Currently, 80% of recycled water is used for agricultural purposes. At the same time, the most water-saving technologies are used in agriculture, such as drip irrigation and circular irrigation. That's why, when talking about the fertile lands of Saudi Arabia, we imagine green circles on fields reaching up to 3 kilometers in diameter. However, with the rapid development of agriculture, the water supply industry couldn't keep up, necessitating more radical measures. Remember, at the beginning of our story, we talked about the western coast, where, thanks to the mountains, rains fall much more often than in the central and eastern regions. For millennia, nomads lived there, practiced animal husbandry and crop production, and roamed these lands in search of fertile pastures. However, in the second half of the 20th century, everything began to change due to urbanization and population growth. As a result, the numbers of pastures significantly decreased and the remaining land wasn't enough for the nomads. Feed did not have time to ripen, and as a result, pastures turned into rocky lands over a couple of decades. In 2009, 2 Saudi princesses visited this region and were shocked to see these changes. As a result, the Al-Baidha project was developed, aimed to reverse the desertification process. Its implementation was entrusted to a Harvard ethics specialist, Mona Hamdi, and a permaculturist from Stanford, Neil Spackman, who lived in nomadic communities for 8 years, building terraces, stone dams, digging wide shallow channels, and planting drought-resistant trees. According to the project's conditions, artificial state-funded irrigation watered the terraces and planted the trees until 2016. But the day came when Prince Khalid Al Faisal officially thanked the innovators and announced the end of funding. Artificial irrigation has ceased. It is hard to imagine what Hamdi, Spackman, and other project participants felt when they watched their creation die. So, for the following 2 years, a drought settled over the lands of Saudi Arabia. Without artificial irrigation, trees and terraces were dying. But the rain came in 2018-2019 and filled all the channels, terraces, and dams with water. And literally before their very eyes, the rocky soil turned into a flourishing savanna. The experiment showed that it is possible to retain water flowing from the mountains and distribute it rationally. Moreover, terraces that retain water irrigate the neighboring rocky areas, and this gradually transforms them into fertile soils. After the miracle shown during Al-Baidha, the government adopted one of the largest programs to date, aimed at restoring agricultural terraces in the southwest of the kingdom. There's hardly any doubt about this project's success. In a few decades, the western part of Saudi Arabia will turn into a blooming garden. A project implemented on the neighboring continent Africa can bring this vision closer. Do you remember that mostly western winds blow over the Arabian Peninsula, passing through the desert lands? And thus, the problem of desertification in Africa is no less pressing than in Arabia. Have you heard about the Great Green Wall? The Great Green Wall is an African Union project to combat land degradation in the southern Sahara. The project involves creating a forest strip from Senegal to Djibouti, 7,775 kilometers long and 15 kilometers wide. 25 million hectares of soil have already been restored and 330,000 jobs have been created. By 2030, it's planned to restore 100 million hectares of desert land and create 10 million jobs. Although the western coast constitutes a large part of the country, The areas to the east of the mountains still remain arid. So, in May 2022, cloud seeding efforts started in Saudi Arabia. This weather modification method is used as part of efforts to increase the annual amount of rainfall in the country by 10 to 20%. Furthermore, in the coming decades, the country plans to plant 10 billion trees. A total of 40 billion trees will be planted in the Middle East in collaboration with other Arab countries. Climate can not only be changed, but also created from scratch. If you haven't had enough of the amazing changes in Saudi Arabia, we've saved the best one for last. Meet the Line, one of the most fascinating and massive projects ever. The construction of a futuristic mirrored skyscraper consisting of 2 separate walls, each 500 meters high and 170 kilometers long, has already begun. The entire life of the city will revolve around this megastructure with mirrored facades standing 200 meters apart. The free space between the walls will have park areas and other public eco zones. Bridges will connect the walls in some places. With an area of 34 square kilometers, the line will become home to a whopping 9 million residents. After all, residential, entertainment and commercial areas as well as schools and parks are designed to be layered vertically. The vertical city will bring residents as close as possible to nature. Think about a huge number of green spaces. The sky, the mountains and every window overseeing a wonderful view. Furthermore, the perfect balance between sunlight, shade and ventilation will ensure a comfortable climate throughout the year. It's planned that the line will have no cars. With a high-speed electric train, you would get from one end of the city to the other in just 20 minutes. These were some cool things happening right now in the Arabian desert. In just 50 years, it has transformed itself from a developing country and an inconspicuous place to the global oil market leader. But rather than spend its income, it invests in its future. Although at the end of the last century, many people believed that the Persian Gulf countries would stop influencing the global economy with the oil era's decline, it certainly hasn't been so with Saudi Arabia. Economic diversification is in full swing, and when Saudi Arabia's oil runs out, they will still have plenty of resources.